that we literally just posted the petition, the online petition, on our Facebook page yesterday, and we've gained 30 plus signatures already. I think it's a really good sign. Plus, just in our regular tabling around campus, every time we would mention this, because we have been working up to this point, all the students would respond with "What?" You know, I think it's a pretty common reaction to be disgusted at that sort of thing. But yeah.
You mentioned earlier the purple pamphlet, and what that is that's one of the products of the Johns Committee. They came up with this this booklet or pamphlet that was colored purple. That's why it was called Purple Pamphlet. And there were in it. Can you describe? You know, of course, without we're on the radio, and we have a lot of listeners. But what is in the purple pamphlet, and why was it so controversial?
Like I said, the purple pamphlet, on top of having all of the aforementioned lewd characteristics given to LGBTQIA plus people, there were also pictures of sexual activity between gay and lesbian couples all throughout, which led to a lot of controversy. At one point, it was even said that the pamphlet was being passed around as pornography. So.
Probably not the intentions of the Johns Committee, we're guessing.
Oh, no, definitely not. Actually, in order to defend the pamphlet, Bill Young actually said, "Our report tried to show homosexuality in its true light. It's a very repulsive subject," after finding out these allegations that it was being used as pornography.
Is that something he said when he was on the committee, or is that something he said more recently?
Yeah, that was during the time of the committee and the pamphlet's first spread.
And so this subject of Bill Young, who was a longtime member of Congress in Pinellas County, being on the Johns Committee decades earlier in the 1960s when he was a Florida state senator, came up during some of his election campaigns. And in 1993, the St. Petersburg Times, which is now the Tampa Bay Times, asked Bill Young about the Johns Committee. And I don't have the original article, but this is a quote from the online abstract of the piece that's on the Tampa Bay Times website. So this is Bill Young's position in 1993, several decades after the Johns Committee was disbanded. He said, as a young state senator in the early 1960s, I'm quoting right now the article, or the abstract of the article. As a young state senator in the early 1960s, C.W. Bill Young sat on the Johns Committee during some of its most controversial attacks on homosexuals. When the committee touched off an uproar for publishing a pamphlet that included photographs of homosexual acts, Young defended the pamphlet's contents, and when a New York book club catering to homosexuals sold reprints of the report, known as the Purple Pamphlet, for its purple cover and purple prose, Young reacted angrily. So that's that abstract. That's maybe where the quote came from that you were saying from Bill Young. I just want to make sure that everything that we're attributing it, because obviously he can't be here. The late member of Congress can't be here to defend himself about this. So. What about just the past being the past? You know, in the 1960s, people had a different idea about things, and Bill Young is known for a lot more in his life than just being on the Johns Committee. Why not just say, okay, so there's a building named after a longtime U.S. member of Congress who was responsible for millions of dollars coming into the region. That's fine. Why do you disagree with that?
Okay, so I think that there's a real problem with believing that the past is just the past, especially considering the legacy of the Johns Committee. During the time of the Johns Committee, by 1963, I want to say that there was some 35 to 37 professors around the state of Florida that were fired. Actually, it was 39, and also including deans. As well as revoking the teaching certificates for 71 public school teachers, on top of numerous expulsions of students. And also even like one of the tactics of the Johns Committee was actually to use the police to come into classrooms, and they would pull students or teachers out and harshly investigate them. Actually, at one point, a I believe it was UF professor killed himself because of the intensity of the investigations and accusations of him being homosexual.
And they also set up these sting operations where there was an investigator, a former investigator maybe from the FBI, who would invite people to their parties, and then they would have these parties where then some of it was photographed or whatever, and then they used that as propaganda or maybe coercion to get more people out. Do you know anything about that?
I don't really know about that, but I know on a very similar, I guess in a very similar way, informants were used very often to come into leftist organizations, including SDS and others, in that time to find quote-unquote evidence of them being terrorists or, what have you, against the state, being subversives.
Yeah, and I should say that we refer to this as the Lavender Scare. The parallel would be the Red Scare of the communists. It wasn't just people, LGBT people, that this committee was going after. It was also going after communists and so forth. Let me read to you from Watermark from a few years ago. Watermark is a LGBT publication in Florida. And this is a quote from that article. It says, "One way the committee searched out gay men and lesbians was by hiring former FBI agent William Tanner to act as a security guard at FSU. Tanner would throw large parties and informants would secretly tape the gatherings." And Tanner spoke in a 1991 interview. He said, "It was, 'I've got a party, I'd like you to attend,' or 'I'd like you to go out and do a little trolling,'" Chief William Tanner said in a 1991 interview with the Miami Herald. "After the party, the participants would be interrogated and either expelled or fired." So this is one of the results of the Johns Committee, and that's one of the reasons why you're upset at Bill Young, who was a member of this committee in the 1960s, having his name at USF.
Absolutely.
All right, let me go to the phones. We're going to go to the phones right now. I'm going to give out the number first. My name is Seán Kinane. You're listening to Midpoint Monday on 88.5 FM, WMNF Tampa. Our guests are Danya Zituni and Elizabeth Kramer from Tampa Bay Students for a Democratic Society at USF. And the number to call, 813-239-9663. If you'd like to email us, it's dj@wmnf.org. You can text us at 813-433-0885. And we have Zebulon in Tampa. Hi, Zebulon. What's on your mind?
The reason I called in, I just wanted to mention that, I don't think we have any public buildings that I know of that are named after Senator Joe McCarthy, who was behind all of the witch hunts in the 1950s regarding communist affiliation. So, I think the activism that they're involved in is, something that I could definitely get behind, because regardless of how you feel about homosexuality, let's face it, there are ways that you go about expressing disagreement, if you have disagreement, without conducting witch hunts and entrapment and all kinds of subversive type of activities, which really violate the Constitution. Now, getting back to what Obama was saying about Libya, for years, America claimed that Gaddafi was a terrorist. They had all this evidence on him that he was a terrorist, this, that, and the other. It's interesting to me that, and they did try to kill him, I think, when Reagan was president and didn't succeed. But it's interesting to me that, they didn't go after overturning Libya's government until after Gaddafi pretty much disassociated himself from terrorism and started really, being a major player on the legitimate world stage as a real leader, not only of Libya, but of Africa and the Caribbean. And at the time that they overturned the Libyan government, Gaddafi was heavily involved in trying to set up a Bank of Africa that could be independent of the IMF, since the IMF has this vulturistic relationship with most African countries, and also for the Caribbean as well. And right at the point at which he was getting ready to make things happen, economically and politically for Africa and the Caribbean, that's when we chose to go in and kill him and overturn his government. This, coming after the fact, after we basically murdered a world leader who had, turned away from terrorism and turned away from a lot of the negativity that characterized the early part of his regime, to now say that we want stability in Libya, to me, it just really smacks of rank hypocrisy, and that's all I wanted.
All right, thank you for that call, Zebulon. So, are you still there? Okay, I was going to ask, I didn't think about it till too late, but I want to ask our listeners what they think about, Bill Young's legacy. He was on the Johns Committee. But is there more to his legacy than that, or is that enough that where it's a complete black eye and that's the end of the story? 813-239-9663. Our guests are from the Tampa Bay Students for a Democratic Society, Danya Zituni, sorry Danya, and Elizabeth Kramer. And so what Zebulon brought up was that Joe McCarthy, who was in charge of the Red in Washington, the McCarthy hearings, he made that parallel between that and there's no buildings named after McCarthy. And I can't tell you that for sure. I don't know if there are or not, but that he doesn't deserve any buildings named after him, McCarthy. So he's kind of agreeing with you on that. What's your opinion?
Well, I mean, we can't ignore that C.W. Bill Young ruined many lives of professors and students in the Florida University system. So the continued veneration of the senator through the building's namesake can only be seen as support for both the Red and Lavender Scare, and therefore endorsing bigotry and state repression. So, you know, we're concerned with the credibility USF would lose should the administration refuse to comply with our demands.
All right, and I'm going to go back to the email right now, and this is from Jerry, and oh, sorry about that. It's anonymous. I read that after I read the name. Sorry about that. I definitely won't read your last name. I'm happy to hear about the plus part of LGBT, as I fall in the asexual category and never felt included anywhere, so I definitely approve of amending LGBT with the plus. So that's going back to the question of the definition of inclusivity, I guess. How has the administration reacted so far to this petition?
Well, so far we've scheduled a meeting with them, so they have agreed to that. But I'm hoping that they will respond, in a positive way. I think it would be in their benefit to change this name, and hopefully if they do agree, we will get a written statement saying that they have agreed to change it on paper. But if they do not, then we will have to proceed with putting more pressure on the administration by holding rallies and demonstrations.
You've also gone to them about, similar to in the military, in talking about Central Command and the connection between USF and Central Command. Give our listeners who might not have heard about that a little bit of background about your campaign about trying to break the ties between USF and U.S. Central Command.
Right, so, we are also using this demand to build a broad range of forces to connect to our long-term goal of cutting the contracts between USF and both U.S. CENTCOM and U.S. SOUTHCOM. And, CENTCOM controls the military operations in the Middle East, whereas SOUTHCOM controls them in Latin America. So we see the connection between the continued homophobia, hosted within the ROTC program, which is where the CWY building is, and the repression on an international scale through wars and occupations that the USF supports through these contracts.
What's the response been on that issue?
Well, as we said, it's been very positive so far to the demand to change the name. I think that's very winnable. But in terms of canceling these contracts, we're going to need a lot more pressure, I think, to achieve it. That's why it's a much more long-term goal.
I mean, there are, undeniable connections between homophobia and the military, and, I think it's not a coincidence that the C.W. Bill Young building is also home to the ROTC program at our university. What is sort of the difference between oppression of LGBTQI plus people here in the United States versus the military going overseas and destroying the lives of LGBTQI plus abroad? So we oppose the U.S. military on our campus, and we oppose the name of the building. So.
We have a caller from Anna Maria Island. It's Susan. Hi, Susan. What's on your mind?
Taking up this cause. There very, very important that people not be second class citizens because of your beliefs. I just sent an email to your team, but truthfully, can people outside, that's outside, I'd be happy to do it.
Susan, you're breaking up a little bit. People outside of what can do what?
People outside of USF, not students inside, and I just wondered, could you give me?
Yeah, so Susan is asking, where can people go to sign this petition, and can they sign it if they're not a USF student?
Right, well, the petition is posted online on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Tampa Bay SDS, and it is free for anyone, either a USF student or not, to sign this petition. And it is likely that we're not going to use the signatures from the actual online petition, but we're using it as more of a way to spread awareness, like political awareness about this campaign, and sort of build solidarity, whereas the petition, the physical copy itself, we're distributing for students to sign. But as for the online one, that's open for anybody.
It's also on petition.org? No, change.org, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the link to the petition is on our Facebook page. But I think, even though it might not seem like the petition online is going to be used for much other than solidarity, with our cause, definitely if you would like to get involved, we are going to be holding events, such as rallies and other things of that nature on campus. So if you follow our page, once again, facebook.com/Tampa Bay SDS, we post about our events coming up, and if you would like to come out and hold signs and scream for, LGBTQI plus liberation, then let's do it. Thank you.
Susan, let me ask you, what do you know, do you have a feeling about the legacy of Bill Young and whether that his legacy should be just defined by that one committee that he was on?
I don't ever think that 100% should be, your legacy. But this is a big deal. This reaches all of our society, and I think it is huge. And I think that we should all stick together. And like I said, I don't know if you heard me. There's no such thing as second-class citizens. We're all, we're all brothers and sisters. We all should be equal. And I think it's not a big deal. Take his name off of it, just to show that we're not going to tolerate it.
Susan, thanks for calling. You're listening to WMNF Tampa. I'm Seán, the host of Midpoint Monday. Our guests in the studio are Danya Zituni and Elizabeth Kramer. The number to call is 813-239-9663. The email is dj@wmnf.org, and the text is 813-433-0885. Danya and Elizabeth are members of Tampa Bay Students for a Democratic Society. I think people may have heard of SDS from the 60s, and then it rejuvenated a few years ago. Who can tell us what is SDS and what the history of it is, and when it was formed and how it reformed?
Well, I don't know the exact dates, but the original SDS, as you said, was very active in the 60s. I can say the major campaigns that it had were against the Vietnam War, against the national oppression of black people and other oppressed nationalities in the United States, during the Civil Rights era. They would also build solidarity with political prisoners. And it was reformed recently in the 2000s. And I can say that the work that we do now is extremely similar, if not the exact same, to what the original SDS did. We've been primarily building opposition and struggle against the wars that the U.S. has been waging, not only in the Middle East, but Latin America, Asia, and Africa. We support political prisoners like Rasmia Odeh, who's a Palestinian activist currently under attack by the U.S. government. We are in support of LGBTQ liberation, which is why we're having this demand,
And you mentioned Rasmia Odeh. She has an appeal hearing coming up next month. Tell our listeners what they can expect from that.
Right, so her next appeal is going to be October 14th in Cincinnati. It kept getting pushed back, but finally she's having it. And here in Tampa, the Committee to Stop FBI Repression, who we work with often, is going to have a rally at the Sam Gibbons Courthouse downtown in solidarity the next day on the 15th.
813-239-9663 or DJ at WMNF if you'd like to get involved in this conversation. Let me read a little bit more from the Watermark. That was that newspaper that I mentioned earlier, and it talked about this is how they characterized the Johns Commission and the damage that it did to the intellectual freedom of people at universities around the state of Florida. It said the committee no one on the committee has publicly apologized or been held responsible for the hundreds of teachers, administrators, and students who were fired, expelled, or intimidated as a result of the committee's purges. So the Johns Committee, it had an effect on university campuses, but other state employees were affected. And some of the universities where it was affected were University of Florida, Florida State University, and USF. In fact, I didn't research this today, but my recollection is that the first time that USF was censured, it was because of what they did in response to the Johns Committee in the 1960s and firing maybe some professors. Do you know about USF, what happened at USF with regard to the Johns Committee?
Well, most of our, I guess in our goal, most of our work has been towards a more broad view of the Johns Committee. I mean, of course, there is the very personal connection with USF, but we have been more broad. However, at USF there was a particularly notable case where a professor, Sheldon N. Grebstein, or he was assistant professor, he was suspended, because he was taking part of sort of the counter movement of the 60s and so on. So he was persecuted for not even necessarily doing activism or anything, but just simply teaching some literature that was, very specific to the time.
Your students now, what's the climate like? I mean, you can't compare it in actuality from being there from the 60s, but from what you've read about what the student activism is like and what oppression is like compared then to now, what's it like being at a college campus now?
Well, I think we can say that, the contradictions between different oppressed groups in the U.S. were much sharper in the 60s, which led to, very heightened struggle. But I would say the conditions that existed then largely exist now as well, which is why we've been, still active and very successful with our political work on campus. We still see USF inviting people such as, very recently, an Israeli general who planned the occupation of the south of Lebanon to speak at USF on a panel about terrorism. And, I think this is just one way that our university is promoting sort of reactionary ideas in support of war, and this is something that we definitely stand against.
You say he was supporting war, and you mentioned his history with the occupation of Lebanon, but that day what he was there to talk about was the Iran nuclear deal, and contrary to the official Israeli position, he opposed he went against Prime Minister Netanyahu
Right.
and supported the Iran nuclear deal. You still think it was something the university shouldn't have done?
Right, well, I think that the reasons for an Israeli general supporting the Iran deal is very different from a reason that, for example, we would support it. We support it mainly because it would end the crippling 40 years of sanctions against the Iranian people, whereas maybe an Israeli general would see it as a way to, make Iran less powerful in the region because they saw the nuclear program as a way for it to gain sort of a regional hegemony. Whereas we see more of the humanitarian side to it, where it would be an end to these crippling sanctions.
Let's go back to the phones. We have Tina in Brooksville. Hi, Tina. What's on your mind?
Well, I was just listening to this with a lot of interest. I've noticed the SDS has been more apparent in the Tampa Bay area, which I'm very pleased. In the 60s, I'm one of those old people. In the 60s, I was in college in Detroit at Wayne State, and it was really quite big there. And I used to, and for a good reason. I mean, it was just post the Detroit riots in '67. And of course, the whole, as they were saying about the history of when it really became active. But what was significant for me, and which made me question at that time, when the Weather Underground started, and they really started talking, I mean, and of course, a lot of this is about anarchy, not violent anarchy, but Fifth Estate was involved too, by the way, 50 years in print in Detroit. But what was really significant for me was when the Weather Underground in Detroit, I can't say about other places, but started some rather violent talk, and people were talking about guns and all that, and I totally backed away from all that. It really was a dividing factor as far as I could see at that time. I made my political evolution of myself over the years, but anyway, I hope this is... to me, seeing this bunch in Tampa Bay area coming forward with SDS, I think it's a very good thing. I was just looking at that. He has an interesting piece. He was part of all of that in the 60s, the death of SDS. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but it's very interesting.
Tina, thank you for your call. MarkRoad.com, are you familiar?
No.
No?
Okay. All right, well, we'll all probably check it out later today. All right, thanks for that call, Lena. I want to read an email from Lloyd, and there's about 2 or 3 minutes left in the show. If you'd like to call now, 813-239-9663. Lloyd says, okay, you've gained recognition and general acceptance for the lifestyle. Most people, including me, are sympathetic and supportive. And can you please get on with your lives and let the rest of us focus on the critical problems we're facing? No offense, but I'm getting very tired of hearing about your cause. It's a done deal. You may now rejoin the society and help with the cause. And I think Lloyd is referring here to, his subject line says gays, LGBT, etc. So who would like to respond to Lloyd?
Well, obviously, as Lloyd said, he is sympathetic, even though his email would suggest otherwise. But I think that quote-unquote getting on with our lives is a real problem, especially whenever, for example, I'm a trans woman, that, trans women have the largest rate of being raped, of being murdered, especially trans women of color, etc., along with the fact that those within the LGBTQI+ spectrum are more likely to be economically downtrodden in our society. I think it's just really ignorant towards the whole situation, right? Like, this building represents, like I said earlier in the show, sort of what we face every day, this in-our-face oppression, so.
Great. All right, thank you for that, and thank you for the email, Lloyd, and I appreciate our guests. Thank you for joining us on Midpoint today, Danya and Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Danya Zituni and Elizabeth Kramer are with Tampa Bay Students for a Democratic Society. I'm Seán, the host of WMNF News Midpoint on Monday. Tomorrow at noon, Mark Biro will host Midpoint Tuesday. Thank you to everyone who called, emailed, and texted today. If you'd like to leave a voicemail with your thoughts, call me at 813-238-8001, extension 114, and I'll play your message next Monday. You can also join the conversation online at WMNF.org/news. I'll put the audio of this show up in a few hours. You can also join the conversation on Facebook or Twitter at WMNF News. Thanks to our engineers, James Rossi and Alvaro Montealegre. Stay tuned for great music, beginning with Fleas.